Did tariffs cause the Great Depression, or was it just circumstantial timing? Hi everyone and welcome to Ainslie Insights, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto and the Gold and Silver Standard. Today, welcome back Alex, who's been doing what she often does and taking us through a bit of history here to give us a bit of context around what's going on in the current day compared to what's happened in the past. How are you going today, Alex?
I'm going really well. How are you?
Very well. Now, can you start us off with that historical context? Because you've written a really interesting piece recently that talked about the Great Depression and how it's often attributed to the Smoot-Hawley, I think I'm saying that right, Tariff Act of 1930. Very interesting there. So give us that little bit of background.
So I don't know much about tariffs, and I've got an economics degree and I've done all of that before, but I've never really looked into tariffs before. And so with all this talk of tariffs going on and what's going on in the world right now, I thought it was of interest. So I guess I looked back in history, and where everyone refers to as tariffs are a bad thing is because of this thing that happened in 1930 called the Smoot-Hawley Act, where they added 20% tariffs on a lot of imports into the US, and they blamed at least partially blamed the Great Depression for it. And, looking into it, I'm not sure that it can be blamed for what was going on. I mean, 1929, as you know, we had the big stock market crash and things started going wrong. Well, in 1929, unemployment in the US was at about zero. Like, it was full employment, everyone going great. By mid-1930, the unemployment rate had already creeped to 5%, and that's when the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were put in. So we're already over 5% before this was put through. Within 6 months, we were at the US was at 12% unemployment. Now, to think that tariffs could create 7% unemployment in a society without the internet and without fast-moving communication seems a little bit crazy, because we look at inflation and what went on over COVID. Well, it took 12 months for the transitory inflation to really be called inflation and really to be attributed to what went on in COVID. So by no means can the unemployment rate lift that quickly because of tariffs. So yeah, there's a lot of conjecture that it was what made the Great Depression worse and what really set it off, and I don't believe it was.
And it's an interesting point that you raised, because when you talk about that example of what happened during COVID and the delay impact that you had with all of that, we've seen that very recently, so we can make that a direct parallel now. And I wonder, which you talked about a little bit in the article, how much of this was tariffs versus actual structural changes that were going on at the time, because obviously during that particular period of time, I mean, there was huge upheaval in the way that the economy was structured. You had electrification, you had mechanization, you had lots of things that were really working to increase productivity around that time, which also would have been contributing, you would imagine, to that unemployment situation.
Yeah, so if you think about what happened from the Industrial Revolutions, let's say the Industrial Revolution, I mean, it started earlier, but let's call it 1890, and we started getting railroads and cars and tractors. So the first part of what happened in the lead up to the Great Depression was the Industrial Revolution. One example of that is agricultural land became 20% more productive. Why did it become 20% more productive? Because the horses and mules that you used to feed in the grass were replaced by tractors, and they apparently used to use up about 20% of your paddocks in a farm. So your productivity in agricultural, just from not feeding mules, forget the tractors ploughing, which would have added to it, that was just 20%. So there was a huge, potential output increase in agriculture. So call that the first 30 years, get us to 1920s, then you've got the railroads moving everything around. Then what you have is electrification. Now, electrification, you create more machines, you create more things. Now, all of that stuff required labour to build things. build railroads, build cars. So there was a huge labour spike to basically create things to take advantage of electrification. So that would have increased employment. But then once you're electrified and you're using equipment and you're using tractors, you just don't need the same amount of people. So it probably took to the end of 1920s, 40 years, for all of those bits that people had been making and the boom that had gone along. And that's when people weren't needed as much. You didn't need as many farmers, you didn't need as many people manufacturing. So structurally, that is what caused unemployment.
And that scares me a little bit because you make the parallel with the AI age in the article to talk about where we are right now. If you think about that being what was structurally causing the unemployment back then, we've been talking about this for a little while, the potential at least for AI to cause structural unemployment in the modern age. And it seems like almost the exact same setup, that you could eventually be looking back at this and blaming tariffs for what happens next when there was something much more obvious that's actually going on behind the scenes.
It created an overcapacity in everything. Overcapacity in agricultural, overcapacity in manufactured goods. And, basically since the start of the internet, compare that to the Industrial Revolution and the building of cars, and it's made working much easier. You need less people to do things now. So let's call that the last 20 years. Well, the last 5 years, pretty much since COVID, the AI boom, call that electrification. So, but this time we're replacing accountants and, real sort of, thinking and university qualified jobs, whereas before it was manual labour jobs, where now, AI is going to replace university graduates. So, are we at the tipping point where there's been so much built and there's been the boom in AI and the boom in AI jobs, but things have been built now? And do we now fall off the cliff for needing people on the other side?
So what's your thoughts around this then, in terms of how we address it from a policy perspective? Because you've got these debates around tariffs as protective measures or barriers that are going to worsen this, but maybe that makes sense in this context. I don't really know. It's something that certainly needs to be thought of in terms of the background of that potential structural change you were talking about with the AI, because if we end up with AI-driven overcapacity here, there's going to need to be something else at play to balance this out, because otherwise we're really just doing the same playbook. Like, even though we're blaming the wrong source, we are heading back into that same playbook that caused the depression, aren't we?
It certainly seems to resonate pretty well, and it'd be a shame if tariffs were blamed. Not that I'm still wholeheartedly for or against. It just seems that it's circumstantial again, that people are using tariffs to target overcapacity, which is what's about to happen. I take the example of the car industry in Australia, which was I am and still am very against what happened. And it's not that I support Australian cars and what we were doing. What the car industry in Australia did was it created a lot of engineers and a lot of people that thought outside the box. A lot of small businesses started off the back of it because people had that thinking and the whole, forward line where you build things and you do things, and if I could do it better here. In Australia, 83% of jobs last year were government-created jobs. We are not creating anything, and tariffs in its own way protect industry that may create jobs, creativity and entrepreneurs. And if you look at, the government and what they say replaces tariffs, which is subsidies for industries, let's be honest, who's going to trust the government to be consistent in what they're subsidising? Who's going to trust them to support small business rather than just big business? So that whole small business entrepreneur style, we're lost because the government thinks that they can subsidise instead of tariff. And I think they've got it completely back to front. So I believe for some industries and high-tech manufacturing, which is a lot of what Trump is actually talking about in the US with chips. There's a lot of talk about opening new plants and things there. If the tariffs work to bring that sort of industry back to America, then it's going to bring skills, know-how and entrepreneurs back to America, and that's a really good thing. And that's the sort of thing that we should be following. Perhaps not a blanket tariff, but tariffs that encourage people.
It's very interesting. I'm starting to change my perspective a little bit on where this is heading, mostly because I was very convinced on what Trump had been saying around these tariffs that he very much wanted them for the reasons that you've described, very positive reasons, really, or reasons that could be interpreted that way at least. But then more recently, we're starting to hear speculation around whether some of those tariffs are going to be walked back, and it's leading more towards being the negotiation tactic that everyone talked about at the start, that he wasn't necessarily, or he isn't necessarily prepared to follow through heavily, at least, and that it's more just negotiation. And I wonder with that whether that's actually problematic, because all we could be seeing is a whole lot of turbulence, a whole lot of uncertainty, which is not great for anyone. It's not great if you're trying to start a business. It's not great if you're trying to, forward plan for a business. It impacts lots of things negatively. So I know this is just speculation at this point, but I'm interested in your perspective on it. Do you think, from this broader policy perspective, whether it's looking at the US, whether it's looking at here, it's just a lot of talk at the moment, and we may not actually see some of these changes come through? How do you view that aspect of this whole situation that's unfolding?
So obviously I spoke about before tariffs potentially being good for small business and entrepreneurs. So if it is just talk, he will lose that bit. The US will not gain that part. But if it is just talk, what it's going to do is it's kind of like subsidies. So what has happened in the way that he's spoken about it is big businesses have now started saying they're going to manufacture in the US. So I believe Honda's putting a new plant in the US, one of the biggest in the world. There's a South Korean chip manufacturer who's talking about putting some new plants there, spending $100 billion. But they're all big business. So I think if he walks back and doesn't do this, you're not going to capture what I spoke about capturing for small business, where you can protect a small business, let it grow and grow entrepreneurs. That's what will be missed.
And that's such a good point, that it would be really disappointing to see that the small business entrepreneur is left behind to benefit large business when they already had the benefit. Like, this is just further protecting them. That's not good.
Yeah, and so I think that's the way, I think you can sort of almost look at it. If you're going to posture yourself, it's probably more like subsidising than it is like actually putting a tariff in.
Look, as always, Alex, you bring such useful insight into this and really help us to understand it from all the different angles, and the history lessons that you bring with this really help with that. So as always, appreciate your deep dive on it. It really helps us. So thank you.
It was always fun looking at history.
You do love that. Thank you, everyone, for watching. We'll chat again soon.